Imagine driving through a small, quiet town in the heart of New England, a place where nothing ever seems to happen. But if you talk to the locals, they'll warn you about one place you should never go: the old Marston Mansion. It stands alone on a hill, looming over the town like a dark shadow, its windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown. It wasn't always like this. The Marston family were once the wealthiest people in town, living a life of luxury in that grand mansion. The patriarch, Reginald Marston, built the house in the late 1800s, filling it with fine art, imported furniture, and all the extravagances of the age. You see, they were the perfect picture of wealth and status. But like any good story, this one has a twist. People say that behind those tall, ornate doors were secrets. Dark secrets. Reginald was a stern man, a controlling figure who kept the family business and his family itself on a tight leash. When he passed away, his son William inherited everything: the mansion, the wealth, the coal mining empire that fueled their riches. And for a while, everything seemed fine. Then one day, it all came crashing down. Without warning, William closed down all of the family's mining operations. Hundreds of workers were left jobless, and the town was thrown into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was William mad? Did he go bankrupt? Some whispered about a strange illness that took over his mind, while others, the more superstitious folks, claimed something darker, something supernatural. After shutting down the mines, William barricaded himself inside the mansion. Neighbors started to notice bizarre things: lights flickering at odd hours, shadows moving across the windows, and a deep, echoing laugh that would cut through the silence of the night. It was as if the mansion itself was alive, possessed by a sinister presence. And then came the event that would shock the town forever. One night, screams echoed through the valley, coming from the mansion. When the authorities arrived, what they found was beyond comprehension. William had murdered his entire family, his wife, his 2 young daughters, and arranged their bodies in the backyard. Each was tied to a different tree in an eerie display that looked almost ritualistic, reminiscent of ancient burial customs of the native tribes that once lived in those lands. It was as if he was trying to send a message, but to whom or what nobody could say. From that night on, the mansion was abandoned, left to rot atop that hill. Some people say that when the moon is full, you can still hear the screams of the Marston family echoing through the town. Others claim to have seen ghostly figures wandering the grounds, reliving their final, tragic moments. And the townsfolk? They keep their distance because they know some places are just better left alone. And that's the first chapter of the dark legacy of the Marston Mansion. Stay tuned. There's more to uncover. After the massacre, the mansion stood silent, but it was far from empty. You see, the story of the Marston family didn't end with their deaths. It only got stranger. As years passed, people couldn't help but wonder why William Marston closed down the family mines. The town's gossip became legend, but no one knew the truth, and most were too scared to ask. It wasn't until years later that some brave souls decided to investigate the mansion, hoping to find answers. What they uncovered was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Hidden in the dusty attic, behind stacks of old furniture and trunks, they found journals. William's journals. And in them, he had written about hearing voices coming from the walls, seeing shadows that moved on their own, and feeling something dark, something alive, within the mansion. But what terrified them most was a recurring theme in his writing: the mines. He wrote obsessively about the family's coal mines, as if they were somehow connected to the sinister happenings in the mansion. He believed they were cursed, and that closing them was the only way to protect his family from something he called the darkness. The journals painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, or perhaps a man desperately trying to make sense of something beyond human understanding. But the real chilling twist? Towards the end of his writings, William described an event. He wrote about the day he found something buried deep within the mines. He never said exactly what it was, only that it was old, angry, and that after its discovery, everything started to change. In his last journal entry, written just days before he murdered his family, William wrote, "The darkness is here. It wants blood. And it won't stop until it takes everything. And then the writing stopped. People speculated wildly after the discovery of those journals. What was in the mines? Why did William close them so suddenly? And could that be the reason for his descent into madness? But no one was ever brave enough to dig deeper, literally or figuratively. The mines were left sealed, and the mansion was avoided at all costs. But to this day, if you visit the outskirts of town, locals will tell you that they still hear things, low, rumbling sounds coming from the ground, as if the earth itself is trying to speak. They say that sometimes, late at night, you can see the flicker of lanterns glowing deep within the boarded-up shafts of the old Marston mines, and you can hear voices, low, whispering, almost calling you to come closer. The rumors about the mansion didn't stay quiet for long. It was only a matter of time before someone dared to challenge the stories, and that someone was a teenage girl named Sarah McBride. She was the kind of person who laughed in the face of danger, and the tales of the Marston mansion were just that to her, tales. One night, on a dare from her friends, Sarah snuck onto the grounds of the mansion with nothing but a flashlight and a thrill in her heart. The plan was simple. Sneak in, take a photo for proof, and sneak out. But as she got closer to the mansion, she swore she could hear soft, mournful cries coming from somewhere in the darkness. Brushing it off as the wind, she made her way to the back, where she'd heard the bodies of the Marston family had been found, tied to the trees like grisly ornaments. What she found chilled her to the bone. Beneath one of the oldest oaks, overgrown with weeds and roots, was a single crude marker. It was a stone, hand-carved with an unfamiliar symbol that looked almost tribal, an arrow through a circle. She felt drawn to it, as if an invisible force was pulling her in, and without really thinking, she knelt down and touched the stone. The moment her fingers brushed it, she felt a rush of cold, like ice water through her veins. And then, she heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, rasping and distant. It said just one word. Run. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She stumbled to her feet, heart pounding, and bolted back to the house to get her proof and leave. She clicked a photo of the back door with shaking hands, when she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. In the flash of her camera, for just a split second, she saw a figure in the reflection of the glass. A woman, pale and gaunt, standing right behind her, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Sarah didn't look back. She ran, all the way down the hill and back to town, never stopping, not until she was safe in her bed with the covers pulled tight over her head. The next morning, she convinced herself it was all in her imagination, that she let the fear get the better of her. But when she checked the photo on her phone, the figure was there, clear as day. Shaken, Sarah went to the local library, determined to find out what the symbol on that stone meant. After hours of digging through old records and books, she came across a legend from the Native American tribes that once lived in the area. It spoke of a spirit, a vengeful entity that was said to reside in the ground, bound to protect something sacred, something buried. And the symbol she found? It was a warning, a mark of protection to keep the spirit contained. It was then that Sarah realized the terrifying truth. The Marston family didn't just find something in those mines. They disturbed something ancient, something that was never meant to be touched. And the murders, the madness, the voices, they were all tied to that spirit, unleashed from its slumber, and now haunting whoever dared to come too close. Sarah never went back to that mansion, but she knew, deep down, that whatever was buried under those mines was still awake, and it was waiting. After Sarah's terrifying experience, the mansion sat untouched for years, feared, yet never forgotten. That was until one rainy spring night when a descendant of the Marston family, Nicholas Marston, returned to the town. Unlike the rest of his family, Nicholas was a skeptic, a firm believer in science and reason. He scoffed at the idea of curses, spirits, and especially at the thought that his family's tragedy was anything more than a series of unfortunate events. Determined to uncover the truth and set the record straight, Nicholas decided to reclaim the old mansion, to finally confront the rumors and hopefully clear his family's name. But it wasn't long after he moved in that things started happening, little things at first. He'd hear footsteps on the floor above him, even though he was alone. Doors would creak open on their own, and lights would flicker whenever he walked past. And then there were the whispers, soft, indecipherable, like a dozen voices all murmuring at once. Nicholas was unfazed. He thought he could handle it, that it was just an old house settling, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But the deeper he dug into his family's history, the more obsessed he became. He read all of William Marston's journals. He traced every inch of the mansion, and it all kept leading him back to one place, the mines. Those sealed, dark mines that had been untouched since the day William closed them. One stormy night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and his own stubborn resolve, Nicholas made his way to the abandoned shafts. Breaking the seal, he stepped into the darkness, feeling the cool, stale air hit his face. He thought if he could just find whatever William had found, maybe he could end all this nonsense once and for all. But as he ventured deeper, things started to go wrong. The walls seemed to close in around him. The shadows danced and twisted in ways that defied logic, and that whispering. It grew louder, more frantic, like a cacophony of voices urging him to turn back. He reached what seemed to be the lowest part of the mine when his flashlight started to flicker. And in that flickering light, he saw it. A figure, crouched in the darkness, eyes reflecting the dim glow like two burning coals. It was human, but not quite. The face was hollowed, ancient, twisted in a perpetual scream of agony. Nicholas tried to back away, but it was too late. The figure lunged, and as it moved, the whispers turned to screams. Thousands of screams that echoed off the rock walls, each one filled with terror and rage. Nicholas dropped his flashlight in his panic, and as the beam spun wildly, he saw what the journals never revealed. Carvings on the walls. Hundreds of symbols like the one Sarah had found on the stone in the mansion's backyard, all scratched into the rock, encircling something. It was a small, blackened object, half buried in the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. The darkness fell silent. Nicholas reached out to touch the object, compelled by some force he couldn't understand. And the moment his fingers brushed against it, he felt it, a rush of cold, like death itself, seeping into his bones. And then the shadows swallowed him whole. The next morning, the townspeople found the entrance to the mine caved in, as if it had been sealed from the inside. There was no trace of Nicholas Marston, no sign of what had happened. But in the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen all over town. Doors slamming on their own, voices calling from nowhere, figures seen lurking at the edge of the forest. It was as if whatever had been buried in those mines, whatever William had tried to contain, was now free. And it was angry. After Nicholas's disappearance, fear gripped the town like never before. Everyone knew the stories, but now, it felt like the darkness was spreading. No longer confined to the mansion or the mines, but seeping into the very ground of the town itself. People started to leave, abandoning their homes, trying to escape whatever had been unleashed. But no matter how far they went, the nightmares seemed to follow. Meanwhile, a team of paranormal investigators, drawn by the tales of the Marston curse, came to the mansion. They claimed they were there to help, to bring closure to a story that had haunted the town for generations. Armed with cameras, spirit boxes, and all the technology you could imagine, they set up inside the mansion, determined to find evidence of whatever darkness lingered within its walls. And they found it. On the first night, they captured footage of shadows moving on their own, cold spots that seemed to trail them like a ghostly hand. They heard whispers, those same murmurs that Nicholas had written about, and their spirit boxes went wild, picking up voices that spoke in fragmented sentences, repeating a single word over and over, blood. By the third night, things escalated. One of the investigators, a skeptic who openly mocked the idea of curses, was found alone in one of the upstairs rooms, staring blankly at a corner, eyes wide with terror. He wouldn't speak, he wouldn't move. He just kept his eyes fixed on the wall, as if he was watching something that no one else could see. When they finally shook him out of his trance, all he could mutter was, "It wants more. It's hungry." For blood, the team tried to leave that night, but every exit seemed blocked. Doors that were open moments ago were locked tight, windows wouldn't budge, and their equipment started to malfunction. Cameras glitching, batteries draining to nothing in an instant. They were trapped, stuck inside the mansion like so many before them. That's when they made the mistake of going to the backyard, to the place where Sarah had found the stone marker, and where William had laid out his family like sacrificial offerings. In the dead of night, they started digging, desperate to find some way to put an end to the madness. And they found bones. Old, rotting bones tangled in roots, buried shallowly, as if someone had tried to hide them in a hurry. They thought they'd uncovered some dark truth, something that would explain it all. But the moment they touched the bones, the ground shook. The earth cracked open, and from that crack, they heard it, a deep, guttural growl, like something waking up, something ancient. The team scattered, running in every direction, but none of them made it far. Some were found wandering the woods days later, lost and incoherent, muttering about faces in the dark and hands reaching out from the ground. Others were never found, and the footage they managed to recover is said to be cursed. Whoever watches it claims to hear a voice behind them, calling their name, urging them to look back. And so the mansion remains empty, but alive. The darkness that began with the Marston family never left. It's in the walls, in the ground, in the very air of that town. And the legend says that anyone who steps foot on those cursed grounds, anyone who dares to disturb the spirits that guard those ancient secrets, will become part of the story. Another voice among the whispers. And so the mansion waits, silent and still, waiting for the next person to come, waiting for the blood it craves. Let me take you to the twisted world of the Sinclair family, a family that seemed perfect on the outside, but hid a chilling secret for generations. In their small, tight-knit town, the Sinclairs were known for their strong religious faith, always attending church, always giving generously to the community. They were respected, admired even, and had a powerful influence over everyone who lived there. But the truth about the Sinclairs ran much deeper than their pristine public image. It was whispered, ever so quietly, that their devoutness was just a mask for something much darker. You see, the Sinclairs were part of something ancient, a secret cult that had been passed down from parent to child for centuries. To outsiders, they were upstanding citizens, but within their family walls, they held rituals. Rituals that no one else was allowed to know about, let alone witness. Their mansion, an old, sprawling estate on the edge of town, was where it all took place, and hidden away, deep in the house's cellar, was an altar stained with time and marked with symbols no one could recognize. Whenever someone questioned those strange symbols, the family would brush it off as old family heritage or heirlooms from Europe, and people believed them because, well, who would dare accuse such a pious family of something sinister? But every generation, there were whispers, rumors of strange gatherings at the Sinclair estate, especially on moonless nights. Shadows moving behind the curtained windows, candlelight flickering late into the night, and sounds like chanting, muffled and rhythmic, spilling out into the darkness. Some say they heard the low hum of a drum beating, almost like a heartbeat, while others claim to have seen people, hooded figures, moving like shadows across the grounds. Yet no one ever spoke up. No one ever questioned the Sinclairs directly. They were powerful, too powerful, and in a town where secrets were buried deep, it was better to let some things stay hidden. It was believed that their faith and rituals brought them prosperity, protection from misfortune, wealth, and influence that never seemed to run dry. But at what cost? What price did the Sinclairs pay to keep that dark power alive? That was the question nobody dared to ask, but everyone quietly wondered. And every once in a while, one of the Sinclairs would slip. A drunken family member at a party, a stray mention of tradition when they meant something far more sinister. But those slips were quickly covered up, swept under the rug like dust. But you see, the darkness has a way of slipping out through the cracks. And what the town didn't know, what they could never know, is that those rituals weren't just for show. They were binding, and the Sinclairs believed that they were holding something back, something old and ravenous, a power that gave them everything, but demanded so much more. The first step was devotion. The second was a price paid in secrets and shadows. And that's where our story really begins. The rituals of the Sinclair family weren't just folklore. They were real. And hidden beneath the facade of their pristine mansion was the true heart of their darkness. The cellar. It was there, beneath layers of brick and stone, that they practiced their forbidden rites. No one from outside the family ever set foot down there, but those who lived nearby spoke of strange noises that would echo up from underground. Low, guttural chants like a prayer to something unholy. One day, when the house was under renovation, construction workers accidentally broke through one of the cellar walls and discovered something terrifying. Behind that wall was a hidden room, an antechamber filled with all sorts of disturbing artifacts. Animal bones, jars filled with darkened liquids, and carvings, everywhere carvings of symbols that no one could decipher. And in the center of it all stood a stone altar, stained dark with what looked like centuries of blood. The workers were horrified, but the Sinclairs moved quickly. They paid the crew handsomely to keep quiet, claiming it was an old family relic and that it held sentimental value. But one of the workers, too disturbed by what he had seen, spoke up to a local journalist, someone he trusted. That journalist dug a little too deep, and before he knew it, his life began to unravel. Strange phone calls, his tires slashed, family members receiving threats. He dropped the story, and just like that, the truth was buried again. And the Sinclairs? They sealed that room back up, reinforced the cellar walls, and doubled down on their secrecy. But things didn't stay quiet for long, because soon after, the town started noticing disappearances. A missing pet here, a stray animal there. Nobody thought much of it at first. After all, it was a rural town and things happened. But then it wasn't just animals. A local boy vanished without a trace while riding his bike near the woods surrounding the Sinclair estate. Search parties combed the area, but no sign of him was ever found. His mother swore she saw a figure watching from the mansion's window the night he disappeared, but no one believed her. Or maybe they didn't want to believe her. The Sinclairs held a vigil for the missing boy, all dressed in black, leading prayers and mourning like the rest of the town. But if you looked closely, there was something almost rehearsed about their grief, something hollow. It was as if they were playing a part, going through the motions because that's what was expected of them. And the rumors spread. People started to wonder if these disappearances were connected to the Sinclairs' rituals, if the cellar held more than just forgotten family heirlooms. There were hushed conversations at the local diner, and parents warned their kids not to go near the Sinclair property. And yet, the family remained untouchable, wealthy, respected, and somehow always just out of reach of suspicion. Then came the night when the cellar door was left open. A neighbor, up late, claimed to see flickering lights coming from the mansion's basement windows, red and gold, like firelight. And the sounds. The chanting had returned, louder than ever, filling the night air with a rhythm that seemed to make the very ground pulse. The next morning, that cellar door was locked again, the lights gone, and the mansion as silent as a tomb. And those who heard the chanting, they said it was like something calling them, pulling them in, urging them to come closer. A feeling like being lured into the darkness to be part of whatever the Sinclairs were doing down there. And so, the altar remained hidden, the bones remained buried, and the rituals carried on, unseen but ever present. Whatever the Sinclairs were keeping secret in that cellar, it was powerful, and it was hungry. Then came the disappearances that would shake the town to its core. At first, they were whispers. Someone's sister didn't come home after work. An elderly man wandered off one night and was never seen again. But as the months went on, more and more people went missing. They would vanish without a trace, leaving behind homes with the lights still on, meals half-eaten, or cars abandoned on the side of the road. The town was gripped with fear. Parents kept their children indoors after dark, and everyone knew not to be out alone at night. Some even left town altogether, claiming they felt something dark, something evil, pressing down on the town like a thick fog. But no one dared point the finger directly at the Sinclairs, not openly. To accuse such a powerful family would be asking for trouble no one wanted. But it was clear to everyone that these disappearances followed a pattern. They seemed to coincide with times of misfortune for the Sinclair family. If a business deal fell through, if a member of the family got sick, or if their wealth seemed threatened in any way, someone would go missing. It was as if the Sinclairs' rituals were tied to keeping their fortune alive, as if they were offering something or someone to maintain their grip on power. The most shocking case was when a beloved teacher from the local school went missing. Ms. Hastings was well liked by everyone. Kind, patient, the type who stayed late to help struggling students and volunteered at every town event. One day, she simply didn't show up to class. The police searched her home and found everything in order, except for one chilling detail. On the mirror in her bedroom, there was a symbol drawn in what looked like ash, a circle with an arrow through it, the same symbol that had been found in the Sinclair cellar. The police tried to investigate the Sinclairs, but they were stonewalled at every turn. They were told that the family was out of town, or not available, and the authorities never managed to get inside the mansion. Some officers even quit the force, claiming they felt watched, followed, haunted by something they couldn't explain. People started to talk more openly then, whispers growing into louder suspicions. What were the Sinclairs hiding? Why did their luck seem to improve after every tragedy? And what did that symbol mean, the circle and the arrow that kept appearing like some kind of ominous calling card? It was around this time that a former Sinclair family member, a cousin who had long since left town and distanced themselves from the family, came forward with a horrifying confession. They spoke of growing up in a household where devotion was everything, where strange ceremonies were carried out under the cloak of night, and sacrifices were made to maintain the bond. When pressed for details, they went pale, their voice shaking as they described the final ritual they witnessed before fleeing town for good. A circle of hooded figures, standing around that stone altar in the cellar, chanting in a language they didn't understand. And in the center of that circle, a young girl, bound and blindfolded. The cousin claimed to have run from the house that night and never returned, terrified of what would happen if they stayed. But before they fled, they said they saw the girl's face. And it was a face they recognized. It was someone from town, someone who was never seen again. The town was horrified, and for a while, there was talk of storming the Sinclair mansion, breaking down the doors, and putting an end to whatever horror was happening inside. But the Sinclairs were untouchable. They hired lawyers, called in favors, and made sure that anyone who tried to investigate found their efforts mysteriously blocked. The cousin's confession, powerful as it was brushed off as the ramblings of a disgruntled family member. And the story, like so many others, was buried. But the people who lived through those times, who heard the chants, who saw the shadows moving on those moonless nights, they never forgot. They knew that every time the Sinclairs prospered, someone else paid the price. And that price was blood. It was the youngest Sinclair who finally broke the silence. Elise Sinclair, bright, rebellious, and tired of living under the heavy shadow of her family's traditions. For years, she'd felt trapped in that house, suffocated by the constant rituals, the hushed conversations, and the locked doors she was forbidden to open. While the rest of her family clung to the cult's ancient ways, Elise questioned, rebelled, and wanted out. One night, after another grim family ceremony, Elise confided in her closest friend, someone outside the Sinclair name, someone she trusted with her life. She confessed everything. The rituals, the sacrifices, the pressure to carry on the family duty. But more than that, she spoke about the darkness that seemed to cling to the mansion. The feeling that she was never alone, that eyes were always on her, watching her every move. And the cellar. She said there was something in the cellar, something alive that whispered to her in the dead of night, urging her to come closer, to join the family in their rituals, to embrace the power they all worshipped. Elise had never been part of the rituals directly. She had been protected or perhaps shielded from the truth. But now, with her 18th birthday approaching, she knew they would soon try to pull her into the fold completely. She had seen it happen to her older siblings, and she was terrified of what initiation might mean. So she made a plan to escape. She packed a bag, stole some cash, and waited for the right moment. But her escape was not meant to be easy. Her family always seemed to know. It was as if they could read her mind, or as if the house itself whispered her secrets back to them. That night, the night she tried to leave, the storm was raging. Thunder crashed, rain pounded against the mansion's windows, and Elise crept down the stairs with only her coat and a flashlight. But as she reached for the front door, she was stopped cold by her father's voice. Low, calm, and far too close. "Going somewhere, Elise?" he said, standing in the doorway to the cellar, a shadow among shadows. Dragged back into the house, Elise was taken to the one place she feared most, the cellar. Her father and the other Sinclairs led her down the narrow staircase, the air growing colder, heavier with each step. The cellar was pitch black, but she could sense it. The altar, the symbols carved into the walls, and something else. Something that felt alive, pressing against her chest like a weight. Her family surrounded her, forming a circle around the altar, their faces hidden behind dark hoods, eyes glinting in the flickering candlelight. They told her it was time to embrace her heritage, to become one of them fully. And for the first time, Elise saw the full extent of what devotion meant. She saw the blood-stained tools, the relics passed down through generations, and the book, the ancient, leather-bound tome with pages written in a language long forgotten. They handed her a blade, cold and heavy in her hand. They told her that to break free, she had to complete the rite. But in that moment, Elise realized that breaking free didn't mean escaping. It meant surrendering to the family, to the cult, to whatever dark force they served. But Elise refused. She dropped the blade, turned, and ran. Up the stairs, through the hallway, her family's voices screaming behind her, chanting louder and louder until it sounded like a roar in her ears. The house seemed to twist around her, the floor shifting beneath her feet, the walls narrowing as if to trap her. But somehow, she made it out the front door, out into the pouring rain. The townspeople found her the next morning, wandering along the highway, soaked to the bone and shaking uncontrollably. She was barely coherent, mumbling about the voices, the shadows, and the eyes that never blink. They took her to the hospital, but when her family came to retrieve her, she refused to go back. She told the doctors she would rather be anywhere than return to that mansion. Elise eventually left the town, leaving everything behind, her family, the house, the cult. But the Sinclairs didn't let go of their traditions. If anything, they doubled down, claiming that Elise was lost and needed time to find her way back, and the town watched in silence as the Sinclairs carried on, as if nothing had changed. But now, they were sure of one thing. Whatever power the Sinclairs were serving, it didn't let go easily, and the price for refusing it was a fate far worse than death. After Elise's escape, the Sinclairs grew more reclusive, and it seemed as if their grasp on the town only tightened. But with Elise gone, something in the mansion shifted. The once well-kept grounds became overgrown and wild, and the towering structure itself began to show signs of decay. Cracks forming in the walls, shutters hanging loose, like the house was falling apart from the inside out. But the family ignored it. To them, the mansion was still sacred ground, still the center of their power. The rituals became more frequent, more intense. And as they did, the effects spread. People would wake in the middle of the night to a feeling of suffocation, as if unseen hands were pressing down on their chests. Strange symbols appeared on doorsteps around town, carved into wooden doors, painted on brick walls. Those same symbols that marked the Sinclair cellar. And some mornings, townspeople would wake to find small animals, rabbits, birds, even stray cats, laid out in perfect circles, drained of life, like some kind of offering. The Sinclairs remained untouchable, but their influence grew darker. And then came the fire. One night, when the moon was barely a sliver in the sky, a glow was seen from the top of the hill. The mansion was burning. Flames leapt from the roof, licking the sky like the tongues of a hungry beast, and smoke billowed out in thick, black clouds. The entire town rushed to the scene, but as they arrived, they found something that would haunt them forever. The family stood outside, perfectly calm, lined up in a row like they were watching a show. Not one of them tried to put out the fire. Not one of them screamed or cried or even moved. And as the townsfolk approached, one brave soul finally spoke up and asked, "What happened? Why aren't you trying to stop it?" The head of the Sinclair family, the patriarch with eyes as cold as the winter, simply smiled. A thin, knowing smile, and said, "It's time to cleanse. This is how we begin again." The townspeople didn't understand what he meant, but when they looked closer, they saw that the Sinclairs were holding hands, and each wore something around their necks. A small, black pendant, etched with that same circle and arrow symbol. They were chanting low, rhythmic, and it wasn't in English. It was the language Elise had described, the one from the rituals. And the moment the chanting stopped, the flames died. Instantly, as if someone had flicked a switch. The mansion stood there, charred and broken, but still standing, still intact. The authorities searched the house afterward, looking for any sign of arson, but they found something much worse. In the cellar, in that hidden room, they found the altar once more. But this time, it was different. There were fresh carvings around it, new symbols etched into the stone, symbols that none of the experts could identify. And on the altar itself, in the center of all those markings, was a book. An old, leather-bound book with pages as thin as parchment, filled with that strange, indecipherable language. The last page was smeared with something dark, something dried and brown, and at the bottom was a single word written in English: renewal. The town thought that maybe, just maybe, the fire had ended whatever darkness gripped the Sinclairs. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. No more chanting, no more disappearances, and the mansion sat empty and silent, like a skeleton on the hill. But as the months went on, strange things started to happen again. People reported seeing figures moving in the windows of the burned-out mansion. Those symbols started to appear on doors once more, drawn in ashes or scratched into wood with something sharp. And the animals, they started to disappear again, their bodies found laid out in those same perfect circles. And the Sinclairs? They never left town. They never moved away. They just faded into the background, blending into the fabric of the town like ghosts. Every now and then, someone would catch a glimpse of one of them in the corner of their eye, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, or a hooded person walking through the old family cemetery. But when they looked again, they were gone. And so, the town lives on, under the ever-watchful eyes of the Sinclair family, never sure when the darkness will strike again. Because whatever was in that cellar, whatever those rituals awakened, it's still here, waiting. And those who live in that town know one thing for certain: the Sinclair's curse never really ended. It just began again. And somewhere, deep beneath the ground, beneath the blackened remains of the mansion, that altar still waits, and the whispers never stop. Let me tell you about the Maynids, a family known for their impeccable taste in all things rare and exquisite. Their mansion was like a museum, filled with artifacts and antiques from all over the world. They were collectors, connoisseurs of history, and their greatest prize was something that, at first glance, seemed ordinary. A tall, ornate mirror, framed in dark wood, intricately carved with swirling vines and flowers. But there was something about it, something unsettling. The mirror was given to the Maynids as a gift from an antiques dealer, a man who claimed it had belonged to a European countess in the 1700s. The legend said that this countess was obsessed with her own reflection, constantly staring into the mirror, day and night. And as the story goes, she dabbled in the occult, practicing dark rituals to retain her youth and beauty. When she died, under suspicious circumstances, they say, her soul was believed to have been trapped within the mirror, bound to it for all eternity. Of course, the Maenids didn't believe any of this. They laughed it off as just another piece of folklore, a way to make an old mirror seem more mysterious, more valuable. They hung it in their grand hallway, right across from the main staircase, where the family would pass by it every day. And that's when things started to happen. At first, it was just the small things you might not notice right away. Strange reflections in the glass that didn't seem quite right, like shadows moving in the background when no one else was in the room. Lights flickering for no reason when someone walked by the mirror. And then there were the cold spots. You could walk through the hallway on a warm summer day and feel a sudden chill, as if you'd stepped into an icebox. Some of the Maenids joked that it was just the mirror breathing, but you could see the unease in their eyes, like they knew something wasn't right. And then came the voices, whispers that seemed to come from the glass itself, soft and muffled, like someone speaking through a wall. At first, they were faint, easy to brush off as a trick of the mind or just the house settling. But over time, they grew louder, more distinct. A soft, melodic voice calling their names, urging them to come closer, to look deeper into the mirror. And when they did, they swore they could see something looking back at them, something that wasn't their own reflection. But the mirror's hold was strongest on the youngest member of the family, Abigail Maynard, a curious, imaginative girl who loved to play make-believe. She would sit in front of the mirror for hours, talking to her own reflection like it was a friend, a confidant. And as the weeks went on, Abigail's fascination with the mirror only grew. She'd be found there, in the middle of the night, standing in the hallway, staring into the glass with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she were waiting for it to speak to her. The family became worried, but they chalked it up to a child's overactive imagination, until one night, Abigail told her mother that she had made a new friend, someone on the other side. When pressed, she described a pale, gaunt woman with long dark hair who spoke to her through the mirror. "She's very nice," Abigail said, "and she wants me to come and play." The Maenids finally decided that the mirror was too strange, too disturbing, to keep in the house any longer. They planned to move it into storage, to cover it up and forget about it. But before they could, something happened that would change their minds forever. One morning, Abigail was missing. Her bed was empty, the front door was wide open, and she was nowhere to be found. The family searched everywhere, calling her name through the house, through the grounds, but she was gone. They were about to call the police when they heard it, a giggle echoing down the hallway, like Abigail was playing hide and seek. And when they turned to look, there she was, standing in front of the mirror, her little hand pressed against the glass. Her eyes were wide, vacant, and her face was pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in days. She didn't respond to their shouts, didn't react when they ran to her. She just kept staring into the mirror, whispering something over and over, too quiet to hear. And when her mother finally pulled her away, she screamed. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house, saying, "She's still there. She wants me to come back." The mirror was covered, locked away in the attic that very night, but it was too late. Abigail never recovered. She stopped speaking altogether, refused to eat, and spent her days rocking back and forth, staring at an invisible spot on the wall. And if you stood close enough, you could hear her whispering over and over, "The woman, the woman, the woman in the mirror." After that night, the Maenids thought they had contained whatever darkness was tied to the mirror by locking it away. They kept the attic door sealed, nailed shut, and covered in heavy chains, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever haunted the glass from reaching out to them again. But the mirror wasn't done with them, and it didn't need to be seen to have power. The family tried to go back to their normal lives, but the house never felt normal again. The whispers continued, creeping through the walls like a chill wind, soft at first but growing louder as the days passed. Abigail's state only worsened. She rarely left her room, and when she did, she seemed drawn to the attic door like a moth to a flame. She would stand there for hours, staring at the locked door, her fingers lightly tracing the wood, as if feeling for something beneath it. And when she was finally pulled away, she would cry and scream, reaching out for the door, yelling, "She's calling me. Don't you hear her?" One night, as the family sat around the dinner table trying to pretend everything was normal, they heard a loud crash from above, the sound of shattering glass echoing down through the floors. They ran to the attic, fearing that someone had broken in or that the mirror had somehow fallen. But when they forced open the attic door, the mirror was exactly where they had left it, covered and intact. There was no glass shattered anywhere in the room, no sign of any disturbance, except for one thing. In the dust that had gathered on the floor of the attic was a trail of small footprints, barefoot and unmistakably belonging to a child. They led from the mirror to the attic door, then simply stopped. It was as if Abigail had stood there, staring at the door, before vanishing back to her room. But when they checked, she was asleep in her bed, her feet clean and free of dust, like she'd never left. The following morning, the family discovered something even more disturbing. They found Abigail's drawings scattered across her floor, rough sketches of the mirror, the carved frame, and the woman she spoke of. In every single drawing, the woman's eyes were wide and hollow, staring directly at the viewer, like they were following you wherever you went. And in some of the pictures, Abigail had drawn herself standing beside the woman, holding hands. The family decided they couldn't keep the mirror in the house any longer. It had to go. They hired movers to come and take it away, to get it as far from their home as possible. But on the day of the move, things went terribly wrong. As the movers tried to lift the mirror, one of them slipped, and it came crashing down. But instead of breaking, the glass remained intact, as if the mirror was resisting. When they finally managed to lift it and take it down the stairs, every step they took seemed heavier than the last, and the air around them grew thick, like they were wading through water. And then, as they reached the front door, one of the movers let out a yell. A shard of glass had cut through the heavy blanket covering the mirror and sliced his hand open. Blood dripped down onto the mirror, and that's when it happened. The glass seemed to absorb the blood, pulling it in like a sponge, the red streaks spreading across the surface before fading away entirely. In the panic that followed, the movers dropped the mirror, and it finally shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the floor. The Maenids felt a momentary sense of relief, as if breaking the mirror might break whatever curse was tied to it. But as they stood there, staring at the pieces, they saw it. In each shard, there was a face. The face of the woman Abigail had spoken of, staring back at them, her eyes filled with a deep, dark hunger. And as the last piece of glass was swept away, they all heard it, soft but unmistakable. A laugh, echoing through the house, like a taunt, as if the mirror knew it had already won. Breaking the mirror should have ended it. But instead, things only got worse, much worse. The shards of glass were taken away, swept up and thrown into a garbage dump miles away from the house. The Maenids thought that was the end of it, that they were free from its grip. But that very night, the house came alive with a presence they couldn't ignore. It started with the mirrors, every single one in the house, from the small vanity mirrors to the full-length ones in the bedrooms, began to crack. Thin, hairline fractures spider-webbed across the glass, growing slowly until they splintered like they were all connected to some unseen force. And then Abigail vanished again. This time, there was no sign of where she had gone. She wasn't standing in front of the attic door, and she wasn't in her room. The whole house was searched, and the family called out to her until their voices were hoarse, but it was like she had evaporated into thin air. That's when they heard the laughter again, that haunting, high-pitched laugh, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. They followed it, and it seemed to shift, moving through the walls, pulling them closer until they ended up back where it all began, the attic. The door was slightly open, despite the heavy chains that had once sealed it shut. And inside, standing in the middle of the room, was Abigail, her back to them, swaying gently from side to side. But she wasn't alone. There was something else there, too. Something moving just beyond their line of sight. And as they approached, they saw that Abigail wasn't just standing there. She was holding something in her hand, a piece of the mirror, a shard that must have somehow been left behind. hidden beneath the dust and debris. And in that shard, they could see the reflection of the woman Abigail had been talking to all along. Her face was distorted, like it was pressing against the glass, straining to get out. The family rushed toward Abigail, grabbing her, pulling her away from the shard. But as they did, she screamed, a piercing, inhuman wail that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. They covered the shard, threw it into a box, and sealed it away, locking it in the basement this time, hoping that would keep it from affecting Abigail. But whatever force had been tied to the mirror was loose now, and it didn't need the glass anymore. That night, the Maynids were woken by pounding, loud, heavy thuds coming from the basement, like fists beating against the walls. They could hear the whispers again, but this time, they were all around, like a chorus of voices, rising and falling in chaotic harmony. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs, and the temperature dropped so low that frost began to form on the windows. And then the pounding stopped. Silence fell over the house, but it was a silence that was too still, too eerie, like the eye of a storm. And in that silence, they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up from the basement. And with each step, they heard a dragging sound, like someone was pulling something heavy up the stairs. The family locked themselves in one of the bedrooms, huddled together, holding onto each other for dear life. And as they sat there, shaking, they could see it, the shadows under the door shifting, moving like something was standing just outside, listening, waiting. It was only when the first light of dawn broke through the windows that the footsteps finally stopped. And when they opened the door, the hallway was empty. No sign of anyone, nothing left behind but that lingering chill in the air. But from that day on, the Maynids knew one thing for certain. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was a doorway, and whatever they had let in was still inside the house, watching them through every reflective surface, waiting for its moment to reach out once more. And Abigail? She never spoke again, but she would still sit in front of every mirror she could find, staring deeply into it, as if searching for someone she could only see. And if you looked closely enough, you could swear you saw it too, just for a second. A flash of that pale face, those hollow eyes, looking back at you, whispering a promise that it would never truly be gone. With the mirror gone, you'd think the worst was over. But the Maynids' troubles were far from finished. Whatever force had been tied to that mirror had seeped into the very walls of the house, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. And it wasn't just confined to the home. It followed them, like a shadow that lurked just out of sight, always waiting. After that night, the family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it became clear that normal was no longer possible. The mirrors they couldn't get rid of, like those built into the walls or too large to move, began to warp, bending at the edges like they were melting. You'd look into them and see things that weren't there. Faces in the corners of your eye, fingers pressing against the glass from the other side, smudges that would appear in the shape of handprints and then vanish when you looked directly at them. And Abigail? She was never the same. She spent more time with her reflection than with her family, standing in front of any shiny surface. Windows, polished wood, even a puddle of water on the ground. Her eyes would glaze over, and she'd go into a kind of trance, mumbling under her breath as if she was having a conversation with someone no one else could hear. When her mother would pull her away, Abigail's expression would turn cold, almost hateful, as if blaming them for taking her away from her. Then came the night when Abigail's mother, desperate to understand what was happening to her daughter, went back down to the basement. She thought maybe if she faced whatever had been tied to that mirror, she could break its hold over Abigail. But the moment she opened the door, she was hit with a wave of frigid air, like she was standing in the middle of a snowstorm. She descended the stairs slowly, flashlight shaking in her hand, and when she reached the bottom, she could see her breath misting in the darkness. The box that held the shard, the last remaining piece of the mirror, was sitting in the middle of the basement floor, lid wide open. But the shard was gone. Panicking, she looked around, shining her flashlight in every corner of the room. And that's when she saw it. Carved into the concrete floor were dozens of symbols. Circles, spirals, and crude stick figures that looked almost like children. They seemed to have been scratched in with something sharp, but they hadn't been there before. And among those symbols, one word was carved over and over again in shaky, jagged lines. Come, come, come. And as she stood there, frozen with fear, she heard it. Abigail's voice, soft and distant, coming from behind her. Mommy? Do you see her too? When she spun around, Abigail wasn't there. But the basement door was now closed, and in the reflection of the tiny window at the top of the door, she could see her. The woman in the mirror, the one Abigail had spoken of, was there, staring down at her with those hollow eyes, that twisted smile. Her hand reached up, pressed against the glass, and for a moment, she seemed almost real, tangible, as if she was about to step through. With a scream, Abigail's mother ran up the stairs, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind her. But she couldn't get the image out of her head. That face, that horrible, grinning face watching her, waiting for the moment to break free. And things only got stranger after that. Abigail's father began to see things too. Faces in the windows at night, shadows moving across the walls, even when the lights were off. And once, he swore he saw Abigail standing at the edge of their yard, her back to the house, looking up at the sky, completely still as if in a trance. But when he called out to her, she didn't respond. She just disappeared, blinked out of sight like she had never been there. The family tried everything to rid themselves of the presence. The haunting rituals, the blessings from priests, even moving Abigail's room to a different part of the house. But nothing worked. The whispers only grew louder, and each night, the laughter would return, echoing through the house like the toll of a church bell, warning them that whatever force they had disturbed was growing stronger, that it was coming for them. And Abigail? She grew more distant, more lost in her own world, and the family knew that whatever was speaking to her, whatever presence had been tied to that mirror, was taking her deeper into its grasp. And though they had gotten rid of the shard, though they had broken the mirror, they knew there was no escaping the woman in the reflection, because she wasn't just in the mirror anymore. She was in the house. She was in their minds. And she was in Abigail, who, day by day, seemed less like their daughter and more like something else entirely. Something other. Something that belonged to the darkness and to the mirror that refused to die. The Maynids could feel the grip of the mirror's curse tightening, and the house grew darker with each passing day. Abigail was nearly unreachable now, her once bright eyes clouded and distant, her voice barely more than a whisper. It was as if she was fading away, slipping into the grasp of whatever spirit had come through the mirror. But it wasn't just Abigail. The whole family was unraveling. Everyone was haunted by something. Shadows that moved on their own, whispers that taunted them in the night, and that dreadful laughter that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. One night, Abigail's father made a desperate decision. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the sleepless nights, the feeling of being watched. He had to end it. He had to destroy whatever remained of that mirror once and for all. So he went down to the basement, where they'd last seen the shard, hoping that maybe he could find it, break it, and finally free his family from its curse. But as he descended into the dark, cold cellar, flashlight in hand, he realized how much the house had changed. The walls of the basement were covered in carvings, those same strange symbols, etched deep into the concrete as if gouged out by claws. And there, in the middle of the floor, lay the shard. It was impossible. They'd thrown it away, gotten rid of it. But there it was, sitting in the exact same place they'd found it before, untouched, yet somehow glowing faintly in the darkness. The glass seemed to pulse with an eerie light, like a heartbeat. Summoning all his courage, Abigail's father took a hammer and swung it down at the shard with all his strength. The moment the hammer made contact, the shard exploded, not into glass, but into smoke, thick and black, swirling around him, filling the basement with a choking darkness. He stumbled back, coughing, trying to breathe, but the smoke seemed alive, wrapping around him like tendrils, squeezing the air from his lungs. And then he heard it, the voice, a low, melodic whisper that spoke directly into his ear. You cannot break me. I am already here." He dropped the hammer and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. But it was too late. The house was already filled with that same black smoke, seeping from the mirrors, pouring out of the cracks in the walls, flooding every room. And the voices, it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus, rising and falling, all chanting the same thing. "Come, come, come." And there, in the middle of it all, stood Abigail. She was at the top of the staircase, looking down at her family, her eyes completely black, like deep, empty wells. She tilted her head, as if listening to something only she could hear, and then she smiled. A slow, twisted smile that didn't belong on the face of a little girl. "Don't you see?" she said, her voice not quite her own. "She's here now. She's everywhere. And she wants us all to play." And with that, every mirror in the house shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 windows breaking all at once, and the shards rained down around them, cutting into skin, embedding in the walls, sparkling like diamonds in the darkness. The black smoke thickened, swirling around Abigail, lifting her off the ground as she giggled, her laugh echoing with the voices of 100 others. The family tried to reach her, to pull her back, but they couldn't move. The smoke held them, rooted them to the floor. They watched helplessly as Abigail was lifted higher and higher, her body twisting and contorting in the air, her arms outstretched like she was offering herself to the darkness. And then, with one final ear-piercing scream, the smoke rushed into her, filling her eyes, her mouth, every part of her, until she went limp and fell to the floor. The smoke disappeared, the mirrors stopped shaking, and the house fell silent. When they reached Abigail, they found her unconscious but breathing, her eyes closed as if she were just sleeping. They took her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain what had happened. She lay in that coma for days, unmoving, unresponsive, while the family tried to make sense of the horror that had overtaken their lives. And then, one day, Abigail woke up. She opened her eyes and smiled, looking around the room as if nothing had ever happened. But when she spoke, her voice was different, calm, measured, and just a little too knowing. "Is everything all right?" she asked, tilting her head just like she had that night on the stairs. "I had the strangest dream, but I can't remember what it was." The family moved out of the house soon after. They packed what little they could, left everything behind, and never spoke of the mirror again. But sometimes, late at night, they would catch Abigail staring at her reflection in a window, or a puddle, or a blank TV screen. And they would see it, just for a split second, that flash of a face behind hers, that pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back, smiling that twisted smile. And in those moments, they knew the truth. You can try to break the mirror, cover it up, hide it away, but once you let something like that in, it never really leaves. Because a mirror is more than just a reflection. It's a gateway, and some gateways can never be closed.